Snow came early that year, soft as regret, and just as quiet. It covered the prairie in a pale mercy that made every fence post look like a gravestone, and every trail a memory half erased. I remember the way the dust gathered itself along the hills when Silas Boone rode home, shoulders bent against the wind, his horse stepping careful through drifts that swallowed the road whole. He had lived too many winters alone to hurry toward any door, even his own. The cabin waited with its single yellow eye of lamplight, and beside it lay a shape that did not belong to the land. At first he thought it was a bundle dropped by some careless traveler, but the wind shifted and a strand of hair, dark and iced with snow, lifted like a signal flag of distress. He dismounted without a word, because shock, when it runs deep, steals language before it steals breath. She was smaller than he expected a person to be, folded into herself as though trying to vanish from the cold. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, the fabric stiff with frost and something darker. A note had been pinned to her shawl with a nail meant for horseshoes. He did not read it then. He did what a decent man does when the world hands him a broken thing. He gathered her up, one careful arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and carried her inside as if she were a prayer he had no right to speak aloud. The fire took longer than it should have, his fingers clumsy from the sight of her. When the flames finally found their voice, they painted her face in trembling amber. She was young, though worry had drawn fine lines beside her mouth that did not belong to youth. A bruise bloomed across her cheekbone like a storm cloud. He laid a blanket over her, and only then noticed how his hands shook. The note waited where it had fallen to the floor, accusing in its silence. He turned it over slowly, as though it might bite. The words were blunt, scratched in a hurried hand. She talks too much about what she saw. Consider this a warning. No name followed, but there are men whose absence is louder than their presence, and Silas knew before he finished reading which shadow had stretched this far. Guilt came to him like winter itself, sudden and total. He had sent for a wife because loneliness had grown heavier than pride. He had imagined a stranger arriving with a valise and a careful smile, not a wounded girl carried across his threshold like contraband. He felt, in that moment, as though he had ordered a storm and now watched it tear the roof from his own house. She stirred near midnight, a fragile motion that drew his attention from the chair where he had kept vigil. Her eyes opened wide and frightened, searching the room for harm, when they found only him, sitting with his hat in his hands like a schoolboy summoned to account. She tried to rise and failed. "You're safe," he said, the words rough with disuse. No one had ever accused Silas Boone of gentleness, but he moved then with a care that bordered on reverence, offering water, adjusting the blanket, stepping back whenever her breath quickened. She apologized before she told her name, as though her existence were an inconvenience she regretted. "Eloan Hardley," she said, and the syllables trembled like glassware. He nodded, unable to offer the easy reassurances other men carried so readily. Instead he placed a cup in her hands and waited while she drank. Patience, he had learned, was the only language fear trusted. Morning brought a thin, colorless light, and with it the knowledge that the world beyond the cabin would not be kind. The town had watched the train arrive the day before, its windows fogged with cold and curiosity. A mail-order bride was a spectacle, and Agnes Crowley's boarding house had buzzed with speculation thick as flies on summer fruit. Women who had known hardship themselves still found room to pity the girl foolish enough to come west for a stranger. Men measured Silas with narrowed eyes, as though loneliness were a moral failing rather than a wound. Agnes had leaned across her counter and declared, loud enough for the room to hear, that women who traveled alone carried stories they did not intend to share. Calder Vance had stood by the stove, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes, his boots polished to a shine that mocked the mud on every other floor. He had watched Eloan step down from the train with the detached interest of a man choosing a horse at auction. Silas remembered that look now and felt something old and dormant shift within him. Eloan moved slowly through the day, as if each gesture required negotiation with pain. She insisted on sitting upright at the table, on thanking him for bread and broth, on apologizing whenever silence stretched too long. Her fear was not loud. It lived in the way she flinched at sudden sounds, in the way her gaze lingered on the door as though expecting it to burst open. He did not ask what had happened. Instead, he mended the tear in her sleeve, his stitches uneven but earnest. She watched his hands, surprised perhaps that a man known for breaking colts could coax a needle through cloth without tearing it further. When he finished, she took his coat from the peg and replaced a missing button with thread drawn from her own hem. It was a small exchange, almost nothing, yet it settled between them like the first plank of a bridge. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. Snow deepened, sealing them off from the town's sharp edges. He showed her how to tend the goats, how to bank the fire, so it would last through the night. She moved carefully, learning the shape of the place and, by degrees, the shape of him. They spoke little, but the silences grew less brittle, warmed by shared tasks and the occasional almost smile. It was on the fourth evening that the truth began to surface, not as a confession, but as a fragment. He mentioned Calder's name while discussing supplies, and her hand stilled on the cup she held. Color drained from her face with such swiftness it frightened him more than any wound. "He won't come here," Silas said, though he had no promise to support the claim. She looked at him then with a desperation that stripped away caution. "You don't understand," she whispered, and the words carried the weight of nights spent deciding whether to speak. "I saw him, behind the livery. The boy. He was barely more than a child. Mr. Vance said the horse was lame, that it was the boy's fault. He kept striking him even after the boy stopped crying." The room seemed to shrink around them. Silas felt the slow burn of anger, not the hot kind that leads to foolishness, but the colder variety that settles in the bones. He asked no further questions, sensing that the telling had cost her dearly. "I went to the sheriff," she continued. "He said he would look into it. That night someone followed me from a boarding house. I thought it was just the wind." Her hand lifted unconsciously to the bruise at her cheek. Then there was the note. Shame flickered across her features, as if bearing witness were a transgression rather than an act of courage. He recognized the expression. It mirrored his own from years before, when a partner's mistake had led to a death on the trail, and the town had chosen silence over accountability. "The boy," he asked quietly, "is he alive?" She nodded. "I think so. He was breathing when I left." They sat with that knowledge, the fire snapping softly between them. Outside, the wind pressed its ear against the walls, eager for secrets. Silas felt a familiar pull toward retreat, the instinct to survive by staying small. Yet each time he looked at Aloan, at the fragile determination in her posture, that instinct faltered. Winter does strange things to a man. It strips away distraction, leaving only the essential. He found himself noticing details he might once have ignored. The way she hummed under her breath while sweeping, the care she took in folding blankets, the patience with which she coaxed reluctant embers back to life. These were not grand gestures, but they stitched a sense of home into the rough timbers of his existence. One night a storm descended without warning, a white wall that erased the world beyond the windows. The cabin shuddered under the assault, and the lamp flickered as though considering surrender. Eloan sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, her gaze fixed on the door. "It feels like the night I arrived," she said, voice barely audible above the wind. He placed another log on the fire and, after a hesitation that surprised him, pulled his chair closer to hers. Not touching, never presuming, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I thought the West would be loud," she admitted. "Guns and shouting and men who never stopped moving. I didn't expect the quiet." "Quiet can be cruel," he replied. "It gives a man time to listen to his own thoughts." She turned to him then, studying his face as if it were a landscape she intended to learn. "You don't speak much, Mr. Boone." "Silas," he corrected gently. "Silas," she repeated, testing the name like a key in a new lock. "You don't speak much, but you do a great deal." The words settled into him with an unfamiliar weight. He realized, with a start, that he had begun to measure his days not by the work accomplished, but by the small moments of shared existence, the passing of a cup, the exchange of a glance, the unspoken understanding that neither of them wished to return to the solitude that had once defined their lives. Morning revealed a world transformed, snow piled high against the door. As he shoveled a path to the barn, he sensed a presence on the ridge beyond the fence. A figure sat on horseback, still as a carved idol, watching the cabin with a patience that spoke of ownership rather than curiosity. Even at that distance, the posture was unmistakable. Calder Vance did not wave. He did not approach. He simply observed, then turned his horse and vanished into the white. Silas stood with the shovel in his hands and felt the bridge between past and present collapse. The storm outside had ended, but another gathered within the fragile shelter he had begun to build. When he returned inside, Aloan looked up from the table, reading the truth in his expression before he spoke. "He knows where I am," she said, not as a question but as a confirmation. Silas set the shovel by the door and met her gaze. For the first time since she had crossed his threshold, he allowed his resolve to surface without apology. "Then he knows where I am," he replied. It was not a declaration of war, nor a promise of victory. It was something quieter and more dangerous, a refusal to step aside. The cabin, once merely a refuge, became in that moment a place of choosing. Outside, the snow lay unbroken, but the tracks of a horse marked the ridge like a signature written in ice. Aloan rose and moved to the window, her reflection merging with the pale landscape beyond. Fear still lingered in her posture, but alongside it stood a new steadiness, born not of safety, but of shared burden. She did not reach for his hand, and he did not offer it, yet the space between them held a current that neither could deny. Winter pressed close, listening. The fire burned low, its glow insufficient against the gathering dark. Somewhere beyond the hills a coyote called, its voice thin and mournful. Silas understood then that the season had not yet delivered its harshest lesson, and that the choice to stand would demand more than quiet endurance. But for the first time in years, he did not face the coming night alone. The next morning carried a silence that felt chosen rather than imposed, as though the land itself were waiting to see what kind of people they intended to become. Silas hitched the wagon without speaking, and Aloan gathered her shawl with careful hands that no longer trembled quite so fiercely. The road to town lay beneath a crust of snow that cracked like thin porcelain beneath the wheels, each sound announcing their passage to anyone who cared to listen. They did not ride side by side. She sat on the bench, back straight despite the bruise that still shadowed her cheek, while he walked beside the horse, one hand resting lightly against the harness. It was a posture that said more than any vow could have managed. He would not place himself before her, nor behind her, but alongside, where harm would have to pass through him to reach her. Town received them with the wary stillness reserved for spectacles that threatened to become confessions. Conversation faltered as they approached the general store. Agnes Crowley's eyes narrowed above her ledger, measuring the distance between Aloan's injuries and Silas's restraint as though calculating profit. No one greeted them. No one needed to. The absence of welcome spoke plainly enough. Silas requested flour and lamp oil. Agnes replied that supplies were short, though the shelves behind her sagged with abundance. The lie hung in the air like frost. Aloan placed a coin on the counter, her voice steady as she thanked the woman for considering the matter. It was a small dignity, offered without sarcasm, and it unsettled Agnes more than anger would have. Outside, a pair of boys fell silent as they passed, their earlier laughter collapsing into a hush sharpened by curiosity. One of them glanced at Aloan's face, then away, shame rising where mockery had lived. Silas noticed and felt the slow shift of something within the town's spine, subtle but real. They went next to the church, not because either of them believed that prayer would change the hearts of men like Calder Vance, but because Reverend Hale had once said that truth spoken aloud acquires a weight that private suffering never achieves. The door opened before they knocked, the old man's expression neither surprised nor afraid. He listened without interruption as Aloan recounted what she had seen, her voice faltering only when she described the boy's stillness on the frozen ground. Silas stood a pace behind her, hat in his hands, his presence a steadying gravity rather than a shield. When she finished, the Reverend's eyes glistened with the kind of sorrow that does not seek to absolve itself through platitudes. "Testimony is a lonely road," he said, "but it leads somewhere worth going." Word spread by evening, carried not by gossip this time, but by the quieter currents of conscience. The stable boy, whose name proved to be Matthew Cole, appeared at the church with a bandage at his temple and a limp that would outlast the winter. He did not speak at first, only stood with his cap crushed between his fingers, looking at the floor as though it might open and swallow him. Silas crouched to meet his gaze, recognizing in the boy the same fear that had once governed his own youth. "You don't owe us anything," he said softly. Matthew's eyes lifted, drawn by the absence of demand. "He'll come for me," the boy whispered. "He already has," Eloan replied, her voice steady. "And we're still here." Courage, when it arrives, seldom resembles the grand entrances described in dime novels. It comes instead as a decision made in a room that smells of wax and damp wool, witnessed by a handful of people who know the cost of silence. Matthew nodded once, the motion small but irrevocable. Sunday gathered the town beneath the church's sagging rafters, snowmelt dripping from coats and hats in a steady percussion that underscored the tension. Calder Vance arrived late, immaculate as always, his smile polished to a brightness that defied the gray light filtering through the windows. He took a seat near the front, confidence radiating from him like heat from a forge. Eloan's hand rested on the back of the pew before her, knuckles pale but unshaking. Silas stood close enough that the hem of his coat brushed her skirt, a contact so slight it could have been accidental. The Reverend began with a prayer that spoke not of mercy but of accountability, and the words settled heavily over the congregation. Matthew rose when called, his limp pronounced as he moved to the aisle. He did not look at Calder. He looked instead at the worn planks beneath his boots and spoke of the horse that had stumbled, of the apology that had gone unanswered, of the blows that had followed. His voice broke once, then steadied, gathering strength from the simple fact that it was being heard. Murmurs rippled through the pews, the sound of a community confronting the reflection it had long avoided. Agnes lowered her eyes. The sheriff shifted in his seat, discomfort etched across his features like a map he could no longer ignore. Calder laughed, a soft, dismissive sound that might have ended the matter on another day. "A boy's imagination," he said, rising, "and a stranger's tale. Surely we have better uses for our time." Eloan stepped forward then, the movement unadorned yet transformative. She did not raise her voice. She did not point. She simply spoke of the night behind the livery, of the lantern's light catching on a ring she had seen Calder wear every day since her arrival, of the pattern of its engraving pressed into the snow beside Matthew's head. She described the note, the nail, the weight of being followed through streets that pretended not to notice. Truth, when layered with detail, becomes difficult to dismiss. The sheriff stood, his face pale, and asked Calder to remove his glove. The ring was there, its engraving unmistakable. Silence fell, not the brutal kind of avoidance, but the dense quiet of recognition. For a moment it seemed that violence might erupt, that Calder's pride would demand a spectacle. Instead he looked around and saw, perhaps for the first time, that the room had shifted its allegiance. Not dramatically, not with shouted condemnation, but with the collective turning of shoulders away from him. Power, stripped of audience, withers. He was escorted from the church without resistance, the sheriff's hand firm on his arm. The door closed behind him, and the sound of it carried the weight of a season ending. Afterward, no one rushed to Eloan with apologies. Redemption is rarely immediate, yet as she and Silas stepped into the thawing afternoon, a woman pressed a loaf of bread into her hands, meeting her eyes with a nod that conveyed both regret and respect. Matthew walked beside them to the edge of the road, his limp less pronounced, his posture straighter. Weeks passed. Snow receded into patches that clung stubbornly to the shadows of fences. The cabin acquired small signs of a shared life. A second cup beside the stove, a shawl draped over the chair he had once occupied alone, a writing desk fashioned from salvaged boards and placed near the window where light lingered longest. Eloan filled its drawers with pages that spoke of resilience rather than fear. Silas found himself speaking more, though his words remained measured. He spoke of the land, of the way the soil would accept seed if given patience. She listened, offering observations that transformed his familiar surroundings into something newly seen. They worked side by side in the early mornings, planting rows that promised a future neither had dared to imagine when winter held them captive. One evening, as the horizon blushed with the first true warmth of spring, Eloan laughed at something so small he could not later recall it. The The sound startled them both, a bright note in a place accustomed to quiet. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. This time she did not withdraw. Their fingers intertwined, tentative yet certain, and the gesture carried more weight than any declaration. "I stayed," she said, not as a reminder but as a recognition. "So did I," he replied. They stood that way until the light faded, two figures outlined against a landscape shedding its frost. The past had not vanished. It lingered in the faint scar on her cheek. In the cautious way, he still scanned the horizon. Yet it no longer governed them. What had begun as an arrangement born of loneliness had become a partnership forged through shared endurance. If you have ever believed that dignity belongs only to the loud and the unafraid, remember this. It often grows in quieter soil. It takes root in the decision to stand beside someone when stepping away would be easier. It blooms in gestures so small they escape notice, in the offering of bread, in the mending of cloth, in the simple act of listening when another voice trembles. We do not always choose the storms that find us, but we choose whether to face them alone or with a hand in ours. And when spring comes, as it always does, though never on our schedule, it reveals not the absence of winter, but the strength we gathered while enduring it. If this tale has found a place in your heart, walk with us a little further. Subscribe to Wild West Tales, where even the coldest seasons remember how to thaw.